Life isn't perfect. We all have flaws, maybe physically, mentally, emotionally, and some of us maybe all the above. It's what makes us human. There's a growing trend in the medical community, though, specifically the fertility industry, that is seeking to eliminate those flaws before people are born. Parents are making genetic choices about their children, designing them to be a certain way, which has led to the elimination of the unborn that don't match up to the desired standards. Literally, the prospective children have health scores while they're developing in the mother's womb. And this is what some are using to determine which embryos to choose. Watch.
What we got from genomic prediction was just a really simple report, which I actually quite like.
And so did you do IVF so that you could get data on your embryos?
Yeah, but we did a whole new round just to be able to do this because it's so much additional information.
Interesting. So I see these embryos have health scores ranging from like negative 0.96 to like 1.9.
The Titan here, who turned out to be the one we selected, had the best score from our own internal, additional data calculations, and genomic predictions best.
Now, not only does the fertility industry has this troubling trend happening right now, but it has worrying connections to communist China. Because of legal loopholes, essentially, China has developed a rent-a-womb industry in the United States that pipelines children born of surrogates in the U.S. to purchasing parents in China. The problem? Well, it is completely unregulated and these children are completely untracked. Here to speak with us about it is Emma Waters. She's a research associate for the Davos Center for Life, Religion, and Family at the Heritage Foundation, and also visiting fellow of the Independent Women's Forum. Emma Waters, thanks for being on Crossroads.
Hi, thanks for having me on tonight.
So I guess first off, where do you think this desire to customize and engineer children comes from? Like, what's driving this whole trend?
So I think the best way to think about this is to look at the way market preferences have really shaped the way that we think about childbearing in the United States. So if you want to go back as far as Roe v. Wade, all of a sudden children were no longer a natural part of marriage or a natural outcome of sexual intercourse, but instead children became an option that parents could choose to opt into or opt out of. And in the same way, the baby making industry functions along these same lines, that children are an act of the will that parents have the right to choose to create if they want to or to opt out of. And with technology through in vitro fertilization and commercial surrogacy, a lot of these desires of parents is possible for the first time.
Well, how widespread is this form of eugenics in the United States right now? I mean, is it readily accessible to most people, or is this some niche thing at the moment?
So it is readily accessible. We don't have clear data on either IVF or commercial surrogacy due to the lack of regulations or laws that really govern this practice. But what we do know is that the fertility industry in the United States is an $8 billion industry, with IVF coming in at about $3 billion and commercial surrogacy around $4 billion. So we know that there is a ton of money behind this, and a lot of reproductive groups in the United States who have a vested interest in ensuring that there's as little attention on this as possible. And aside from 3 states that either ban or don't allow most forms of IVF or surrogacy, most states allow it in some form or fashion, with states like California, New York, Illinois, and Washington having rather permissive laws, basically boasting that they're an international hotspot for anyone who wants to come and make a child.
Jeez. One thing that kind of shocked me reading about this is these, quote unquote, prospective children. They give them health scores while they're in development. I mean, that seems pretty crazy. What is this? Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, so this has to do with genetic testing of the embryo. So 75% of IVF clinics in the United States offer this form of genetic testing that allows doctors to, at a minimum, assess to see if the child has a propensity for Down syndrome or another non-treatable illness. But they can even go so far as assessing what the sex of the child will be, or the hair color, eye color, skin color. And a couple of years ago, one fertility clinic came under a lot of fire for openly boasting that if you worked with them, they would let you create the child of your dreams, selecting along all of these secondary features. But obviously, the eugenic concern with this means that as technology continues to develop, we have edited embryos before, though that is not common practice. But scientists are even finding that things like your values, your propensity to kindness or anger, and even your IQ is also determined by your genetics. So what we're looking at here is technology becoming more widely available that would allow parents to engineer down to those finer details.
Geez, well, one thing that kind of strikes me is if you're monitoring these, health scores of the kids, what happens to the ones that don't meet the standards of, for the would-be parents? What do they do to them?
Yeah, and this is the really sad underbelly of the fertility industry that I think a lot of people aren't aware of. So it's common practice for a fertility clinic to create multiple embryos at a given time, mostly because of how expensive it is. I think now with inflation, it's about $15,000 to $30,000 for a single round of embryo creation. So to save money, you're not going to just create one embryo at a time. So once they have tested it, parents can select the ideal embryo that they want. And if there's other embryos they might want in the future, they can freeze those. And we have over 1 million embryos frozen in the United States right now. But if the embryos, for whatever reason, don't meet the parent specifications, they're the wrong sex, they could have Down syndrome, those embryos are destroyed. So if you believe that life begins at conception, what you're talking about here is the outright murder of these unborn children.
Well, that, and then a million of them in like suspended life. This seems like some horrible sci-fi movie,
Yeah, it really is, especially when you take in factors like the Chinese rent-a-womb industry that's been burgeoning in the United States for about the last decade. So in the United States, California in particular works very closely with other nations because of how permissive their commercial surrogacy and in vitro fertilization laws are. And so what that means is that couples in China, where surrogacy is completely illegal, can actually work with American fertility clinics to create embryos, potentially of the biological makeup of the Chinese nationals, birth the child here in the United States, and with our birthright citizenship laws, that child who is maybe completely like 100% Chinese national in their biology and genetic makeup actually gains and maintains the full rights of U.S. citizenship. So what this means is that when that child turns 21, parents could even apply for a green card to get citizenship, which is a much faster and much cheaper process than if they were to apply for citizenship through some of the traditional methods.
Jeez, that being said, you mentioned it's like pretty much unregulated or very little regulated. What are some of the dangers you see in this kind of rent-to-womb industry, for other countries, for the United States, maybe 10 or 20 years down the road?
Yeah, and this is where it gets so bizarre. So if the United States is in a Cold War standoff with China right now, what we're talking about are foreign nationals having full access to not only the wombs of American women, but citizenship. And we know that that is a huge national security threat. So, for example, the House China Select Committee is studying Chinese investment across the board in entertainment, in farmland, in media, and so on. But one of the areas that we haven't spent enough time looking into is Chinese investment in Americans, like through the people that they're creating here. And so, like I said a second ago, this means that parents could apply for citizenship. So if a child is born and raised in China, inculcated in their culture and very loyal to their land, when they come to the United States, they're not being flagged as a foreign national who's applying for a job or applying to work in a research lab. They are applying as a U.S. citizen, which means it's a completely different background check process that actually opens the United States up to a lot of concerns. And the main final takeaway with this is because of the lack of regulation and the lax laws around this, we have no idea who these kids are. There's not a database that's publicly available or easy to access where these children are being listed. And so should they apply for jobs, employers in government or private sector have no idea of the background that they're dealing with.
Jeez, well, explain a bit how this works. I mean, it sounds a bit like Handmaid's Tale to me, the Handmaid's Tale, where you have these women who are being used as surrogates, and that's just the way this whole world works. I mean, how do these women, who are these women, first off, who are working as surrogates, how are they employed by this industry? And these embryos that are being edited, are they with the women, or are they just making them and then implanting them in these women?
So for commercial surrogacy in the United States, it's pretty much illegal in every state for it to be the egg of the surrogate because of the obvious difficulties that can arrive with parental rights that comes from that. So typically what would happen is a Chinese national would connect with a fertility clinic, particularly in California. There's about 450 of them that I reviewed recently, but there's many more outside of that. And so many of these fertility clinics actually have a direct or indirect connection to China. So they offer Chinese language options on their website as a common practice. A lot of them have doctors or administrators who once lived in China and moved to the United States to either work at or open the fertility clinic. And 3 of the California fertility centers that I found actually have bases in California, which is bizarre given that surrogacy is completely illegal in California. But what this enables is an easy path for Chinese nationals to connect with a fertility clinic and then from there be connected to a surrogate in the United States. And the way that they screen for commercial surrogates differs from practice to practice. I think generally they try to find a woman in better circumstances, but this is not always required for how they go about it. And then from there, the parents can either create an embryo using their own sperm and egg, or they can purchase a sperm or egg. Many times they travel to the United States, but with technology, they're technically not required to leave China in order to create this embryo.
So you said you looked into 450 of them. I mean, how big is this industry? And I would assume if you have a business, you need to make a profit, meaning they have enough business to sustain all of those. I mean, how big is this industry?
I mean, massive. And once again, because there's not clear data on this yet, it's really hard. But if we know that it's about $8 billion overall, you can imagine the breakdown, especially in California, given how popular that location is. But some of the research that I did also tagged where these stories have been covered. So just to show you how expansive this industry has become, we have op-eds and many documentaries that the New York Times have done. We have 4 or 5 stories that NPR has done covering this Chinese rent-a-womb industry, not to mention stories that have been done by CNN and other local newspapers in California. So the fact that this is happening isn't a secret. So some of the fertility clinics that they interviewed said that up to 50% of their clients in a given year were from China alone. And others had sound bites from Chinese nationals who said things to the effect of, we know that either China or the United States is going to come out on top in the next 2 decades. So it makes good sense for us to have a kid with U.S. citizenship and we'll have Chinese citizenship and then just decide which one we'll stick with in the future.
Wow. Well, I mean, what about human rights? Are there any possible human rights issues with this or possible abuses with it?
I mean, many. So just a few days ago, there was yet another story that broke, uncovering a baby selling ring through in vitro fertilization commercial surrogacy markets where there were children being created using eggs and sperm of parents who were not aware that these children were being created and then being sold to other parents. There were children who were being born through commercial surrogates, in some instances for the explicit purpose of entering into some sort of child exploitation industry, which with the Sound of Freedom recently coming out, I'm afraid that we're all too aware of what that oftentimes entails, especially with pedophilia being one of the top markets for online pornography. So just the human rights concerns here is massive, not to mention the fact that the way the industry is structured, it's meant to separate the process of conception, pregnancy, and childbirth between as many people as possible. So you're telling the surrogate not to have an emotional connection with the child that she is carrying and birthing. You're telling the fertility clinics that they can play God and put together the quote unquote ideal child that a parent wants. And you're telling parents, whether intentionally or not, that children are a product that you can design to be the perfect accessory to your life. So just the way that this is abused and really perverts our understanding of children is massive.
Geez, that's huge. I'd love to talk to you more about it, but yeah, maybe another episode. Emma, real pleasure having you on. Thank you.
Of course, let's do it again soon.